Speaker will be Brian Brockway, who has served as the president, CEO, chairman, and the founder of Nanomedical since 1984. He holds many patents, 20 in the field of implantable medical devices, and has co-authored more than 25 publications in bioengineering medicine. Mr. Brockway earned his Bachelor and Master of Science in Electrical Engineering from the University of Minnesota. Very pleased to welcome you to your talk.
I want to start by saying thank you to Martine for the honor of being able to present here, and also to the conference organizers who have done just a wonderful job. The food has been great. Everything's been running on time. It's a very nice conference and very stimulating as well. What I want to cover today is just a bit different than the abstract that I had submitted. I want to focus today on subcutaneous diagnostic devices for patients with chronic cardiovascular disease. Bob Borge and Jay Yadav and Van Manda are going to be covering the devices that actually take measurements from inside the heart and the pulmonary artery, and I'm going to focus specifically on subcutaneous devices. I want to make a case for a new paradigm in caring for patients with chronic cardiovascular disease, propose that subcutaneous diagnostics can play a significant role in select populations of these patients, make a case for continuous long-term monitoring in these patient populations, and then also propose attributes of a system which I believe could succeed in improving the care of these patients, discuss some of the key technologies that are necessary to implement such a system, and then discuss some of the future advances envisioned for these diagnostic systems. One thing I will not be doing today is showing you a video of my being implanted with one of these devices. I will, for those of you who don't know about Transoma Medical, I thought it might be helpful just to give a brief overview. It's been around for about 20 years. It was founded to commercialize wireless implantable sensors that are used to monitor research animals. And virtually every drug today that has been approved in the last few years has been tested in animal subjects with our devices. And this is an example of a device. This is a blood pressure sensor for laboratory mice. These have been used in almost 750,000 animals to monitor arterial pressure in 20 different species. The company began to develop human products in about 2002 to leverage the technology and the intellectual property that we've developed over the years for use in laboratory animals. So there's a very significant burden of chronic cardiovascular disease around the world. And in particular, if you look at atrial fibrillation, syncope, hypertension, heart failure, these are diseases which together just in the United States consume over $50 billion in healthcare spending annually. And as the population ages, the burden of chronic cardiovascular disease is only going to increase, and it's going to increase significantly. You know, this is one of those problems where there's going to have to be a multi-pronged approach to coming up with a solution to address this issue. But long-term monitoring, long-term remote monitoring of patients living at home is one solution as part of this multi-pronged approach, which could mitigate the burden. These are devices which would provide the patient's status, send information to the physician, allow them to adjust medications, with the intent that these devices would be able to reduce emergency room and clinic visits, reduce hospitalizations, and also improve the quality of life for these patients. Now, with respect to technologies that are used for long-term monitoring, I've divided these into two categories, invasive and non-invasive. You know, non-invasive devices have been used for a very long period of time. Holter monitors, event recorders. There's some new technology called MCOT, mobile cardiac output telemetry, which involves wearing a cellular-based device that will send ECGs nearly in real time to a service center. There's blood pressure cuffs. And these devices where the diagnosis or monitoring information that is needed to to care for the patient can be obtained in 2 or 3, maybe 4 weeks. These devices work great, but when there's a need for very long-term monitoring, as in some of the patient population I'm going to discuss in a bit, there can be significant compliance issues with these devices. If you take a look at external ECG devices, typically patients won't wear those for more than a couple weeks, sometimes 3 weeks. So compliance is a major issue. If you take a look at invasive devices, there are pacemakers and ICDs. Many of those devices have diagnostics built into them. There's the device like Jay Yadav spoke about yesterday that monitors pulmonary pressure. These are devices that involve inserting something into the heart or deep into the body. And then the other type of invasive devices, I've categorized them, are devices that are just placed under the skin. These devices are minimally invasive, they're relatively simple and inexpensive to implant, and typically they have an excellent safety profile. There's been over 100,000 of these devices implanted over the last several years, and the safety profile of these devices has been excellent. Now I'd like to make a case for using long-term continuous monitoring in certain patient populations. And these, one example of this population could be atrial fibrillation. Atrial fibrillation, as you well know, presents a significant risk of stroke. Much of atrial fibrillation is asymptomatic, so a patient could be experiencing atrial fibrillation, be at risk of stroke, and not know it. Those are patients that could be important to monitor. It's important to be monitoring continuously because atrial fibrillation is not only episodic and occurs at unpredictable times, it can also cluster. So you can have patients where it can go for a month or two with no atrial fibrillation, and then suddenly for 2 or 3 days, they may have extensive amounts of atrial fibrillation. And it's important for the physician to know this. Another population is a syncope population, where you have patients that faint unexplainedly and unpredictably at infrequent intervals, say every month, 3 months, 6 months. And then also some patients with slowly deteriorating status that can occur over a period of hours to weeks, like heart failure, difficult to control hypertension, where knowing the trend of how that information is going could be important to the physician in caring for those patients. So this is an example of some data which was published by Ziegler a couple years ago, where they had patients that were implanted with pacemakers, and these are pacemakers that had atrial fibrillation diagnostic capabilities, and they measured atrial fibrillation as it occurred in the pacemaker, which is nearly 100% sensitive and 100% negative predictive value, and then compared that to intermittent monitoring with Holters. And if you take a look at the left side of this chart, you can see that with 24-hour Holters, the more frequently you use these Holters, going from annual to quarterly to monthly, you improve the sensitivity, and not surprisingly, you also improve the negative predictive value. And then on the right-hand side, they did some studies where they used 7-day Holters, 30-day Holters, and then here they asked the patient whether or not they felt they experienced atrial fibrillation. And what they find is that symptoms often don't correlate with the occurrence of atrial fibrillation. In this study by Strickberger, which also used pacemakers to monitor atrial fibrillation in these patients, they found that over 90% of atrial fibrillation was not symptomatic to the patient. And also, when patients reported symptoms that they thought they were in atrial fibrillation, 45% of those reports of symptoms were not actually atrial fibrillation. It was something else. So the point of this is that you simply can't rely on the patient reporting symptoms to know if these patients are in atrial fibrillation. So I'd like to talk a little bit about a system that we believe could be very valuable in the clinic. You can see Dr. McCoy here with his tricorder. That was probably the ideal remote patient monitor. We're a ways away from that technology. So what I'm going to do is show you some attributes of a system that is realistic within the limitations of the technology that's available today. First of all, small subcutaneous devices in these populations are very safe for the patient. They're fast and easy to insert underneath the skin. The goal here would be to have these devices implanted by general practitioners, not to have to go to specialty cardiologists. You want a device that's relatively inexpensive to insert, so ideally it could be small enough and have the right tools so that it can be placed underneath the skin in a procedure room in the office by a general practitioner. Obviously, it should provide information that's useful in directing therapies, high-quality signals, reliable data capture, truly continuous monitoring without data loss, so that in these populations of patients where there's episodes that occur, you know for sure that the device is going to capture that information. And then it has to be simple for the patient. Patient compliance is a big issue. A device should have little or no compliance necessary, something that the patient can virtually forget about. No need to press buttons to make data transfers. Everything is automated. And also, it has to be simple for the physician. It has to maximize practice efficiency. Follow-up of these patients has to be simple, and there has to be minimal workload placed on the physicians if these are going to go into broad use. So now I want to talk about a specific system for subcutaneous arrhythmia monitoring for the syncope and atrial fibrillation populations. This is a device which we just received approval on the week before last. This is an implanted device that is placed in an outpatient basis. It's about a 5 to 15 minute procedure. And once it's implanted, it continuously 24/7 evaluates the electrocardiogram of the patient. If it finds that there's an abnormal rhythm, it captures it, stores it in memory of the device, so there's signal processing on board the device. And then at some later time, it will transfer the information from the memory of the device to a handheld like this, which then relays the information to a monitoring center over the telecommunication system, where there is a trained cardiac technician that evaluates the rhythm strips, and if they see something there that matches the physician's orders for notification, they then notify the physician, and the physician can then follow up with the patient. This is an example of a monitoring center report. The cardiac technicians will evaluate the information that's there and put it out on a report that's available on the web portal. Our service center is actually a subsidiary of United Therapeutics Medicomp, which is located in Melbourne, Florida. So to implement this system, there's a number of technologies which are critical. First of all, long-range telemetry. These devices need to be able to communicate from the implant to the handheld device at a distance of at least 2 meters so that the patient can leave the device on their bedstand at night. Has to be automatically woken up. We have implemented technology here that for 500 nanoamps, we have a receiver that's always listening to wake up the device. This is very important to eliminate the need for patient compliance. You have to have enough memory. There has to be high efficiency data compression on board to produce the minimal amount of data for telemetry, because telemetry is very power hungry. We need sensitive detection algorithms on board, good signal processing algorithms. A monitoring center with computer-assisted human overread. The infrastructure and the software at the monitoring center is very important. They need good signal processing in place so that the operators can more efficiently evaluate the rhythm strips that come in. One of the features of this device is that it captures rhythm strips on a regular basis. This is an example of one programmable mode where this is capturing rhythm strips at 4-hour intervals. These rhythm strips are then transferred from the implant to the handheld device and then forwarded on to the service center. They can be captured at intervals as frequently as 7.5 minutes. And the advantage of this approach is that, and someone said this yesterday, keep the complexity out of the device to the maximum extent possible, and that's exactly what we're doing here by pushing a lot of the signal processing to the service center. So at the service center, you can extract atrial fibrillation, you can extract QT interval. We think that we can probably extract respiratory rate, sleep apnea, heart rate variability, and even down the road, potentially sudden cardiac death risk stratification metrics, all from the ECG strips, which are exported from the device to the service center. In the future, we see that these implantable subcutaneous diagnostics are going to get smaller. They're going to be easier to insert underneath the skin. There's more information that's going to be derived from existing signals. There's going to be new sensors that are going to be added to these devices, better signal processing available, particularly at the service center, to make sense of the large volumes of data that come in from these devices. That's a major challenge because these devices will now produce literally gigabytes of data from hundreds or thousands of patients, and it's important that very efficient algorithms be able to extract valuable information and feed that to the physicians so they can improve the care of the patients. Communication with other devices is also coming in the future, and expanded applications to diseases beyond those that are specific to arrhythmias. These are some of the sensors that I'm aware of that are available today or are not necessarily commercially available, but are very close to being commercially available. Sensors for ECG, arterial pressure, motor activity. Boston Scientific is doing some work with a subcutaneous device for heart sounds and also respiration. This is an example of a device it's not approved for market yet, but it's manufactured by Medical. This is an emergency response device that looks for dangerous arrhythmias and will send a signal to a belt-worn device that if it finds that, for instance, the patient has gone into sustained tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation, it will automatically notify the emergency medical technicians. This is a device that we have prototyped in our laboratory. This is going to be used to monitor blood pressure in laboratory mice. It's about 2 or 3 millimeters in diameter, operates without a battery, uses induced power from a magnetic field. Very small device. This is a device that is been prototyped by Proteus. This is an ingestible communications chip, and this employs intra-body communications. It has a half cell on there that once the pill is swallowed, it's activated by the gastric fluids in the intestines, and it turns the transmitter on, and it transmits a code through the tissue, which can then be picked up by a device like this, and you can monitor drug compliance. So these pills, pills in the future could employ a chip like this so that you can monitor medication compliance in patients. This is another device. This is for arterial pressure sensing. This has a 1.5 French pressure sensing catheter. It's routinely used to monitor blood pressure in research animals. Been used in a large number of species, and this is going to be available down the road for humans as well. So in summary, we have a new approach to caring for patients with chronic cardiovascular disease using long-term subcutaneous diagnostics. There are newer devices that are available today that promise to provide good information to direct therapies, and the technology on these devices is going to advance significantly over the next few years. And one key piece that is going to be important for these devices to be successful is the clinical studies. Many are already underway, and there's many more that are going to be starting that will be necessary to demonstrate the cost effectiveness and the improvement in outcomes using these devices, and also improve understanding among physicians as to how to best use this information to improve the care of their patients. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Are there questions for our speaker, Bob?
Bob Borge, Birmingham. The small blood pressure monitoring device, does it, you put it up against an artery? Is that how it works, or how?
No, it has actually a small, like a fiber that's inserted into the artery.
So that's
is
a little more complicated than the GP, I imagine. Putting it in.
That one is, yeah. That's going to be a while before that one makes it to the GP. But the arrhythmia monitor I think
Easy.
that's not too far away from being done by a GP.
Hey, Julian Penders from Horse Center IMEC. I have a couple of questions. Very interesting talk, by the way. The first one is something to do with the comment you made on the compliance with current Holter systems. I was wondering what was your opinion on which is the main problem for compliance with existing Holter systems?
Well, to best answer that question, try wearing one yourself sometime for more than a few days. I mean, I really didn't understand it until I actually wore one for about 5 or 6 days. And the electrodes are very irritating, or they pull off, or when you go to exercise, they fall off because of sweat. The patients complain about them interfering with lifestyle. If you're interested, there's a good paper in the literature published by Vasemready where he looked at the compliance with external Holter monitors, where they use standard ECG skin patches, and found that I believe it was compliance dropped to 60% within 21 days. And the study was intended to go for 6 months. I think at 6 months, the compliance had dropped down to about 20 or 30%.
All right, thanks. Related question to that. If you look at the Holter systems or systems that we attach to the body, a main problem we have is related to motion artifacts, especially if you want to do long-term monitoring. I was wondering if you have a similar problem with subcutaneous systems as well.
Actually, the motion artifact is much, much less with a subcutaneous system. You have a lot less baseline wander. Quality of the signal is quite a bit better. That's one of the advantages of the subcutaneous system, is that you have a higher quality signal to work with, so you're in a position to extract better information from the signal.
It's Jamil Khan from University of Newcastle, Australia. Which frequency band the transmitter is operating?
We use a 900 megahertz band, which is, there's a new band. It's called the Medical Information Communication Services Band. Medtronic has elected to use that band. I think St. Jude may now be using that band. Transoma and Guidant, or Boston Scientific, now use the 900 megahertz band.
Okay.
And it's an ISM band, so the band is available for use in Europe and North America and most places in the world.
Any particular reason for picking up that one instead of a MICS band?
Well, first of all, there were some complications in using the MICS band. The history behind that is that Medtronic really drove the regulatory piece of the MICS band. They made it extraordinarily complicated. They filed IP around a number of key concepts to implement MICS, and it made it a bit difficult for others to use that particular band. Plus, if you look at the power limitations on the MICS band, we're able to get substantially longer range using 900 megahertz at a lower power level, which is beneficial. You can make better use of power. And also, from the standpoint of the inbound, there's a lot of complications with using the MICS approach, and we actually use a crossband communication approach where we use dual frequencies. Yeah. So we have a receiver in the device which only draws 500 nanoamps, is always available to listen. So there's a number of reasons why we elected not to use the MICS band, and it works very well.
Okay. The last question, did you observe any data loss or anything from your transmitters?
No, and one of the ways we do that is we have a lot of memory in the device. The implant itself has room for about 45 minutes of abnormal rhythm strips. The handheld has room for about 10 hours of rhythm strips, abnormal strips, and then as soon as the information is transferred to the monitoring center, the memory's cleared, so it's available to take new information. So it's quite rare.
Bob Sklobosky, Computational Diagnostics, Pittsburgh. I have two questions. One with the regulatory issues, and the other with reimbursement for services.
Mm-hmm.
Our experience with the FDA has been that they've been very reluctant to approve software which does automatic recognition of different kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like some of the software in your system does recognition. Was there any problem with the FDA in getting the
no,
510K approved?
We actually don't use software inside the device.
Mm-hmm.
We actually have a state machine,
Uh-huh.
which was designed using using logic design tools. So it's not actually software per se. There is software to process the information at the service center, and of course that software is validated by them as an IDTF, an independent testing facility. So it really wasn't an issue. I mean, we had to demonstrate that our device, the implant, accurately detected abnormal rhythms, and that was done, I think, on the MIT database, Physio.
Sure,
Yeah, I think there are 3 or 4 databases that were used to validate the performance of the arrhythmia detector that's in the device.
Okay, the second question is a partial regulatory payment question, and the interpretation of data of this type, typically CMS, which is probably the greatest majority of the people that would use this, are people on Medicare, has severely restricted interpretation of data by technologists, and it sounds like the data coming into the service center is being interpreted by technologists and then referred to a physician. How does that work at the service center end? Is there
From a standpoint of reimbursement?
well, from the standpoint of the regulatory issue, and then the second part of that question, which I'll give you at the same time, is the reimbursement. Are there CPT codes for this kind of monitoring, which allows both the technical and the professional components to be captured?
Yeah, regarding the regulatory issue at the monitoring center, I'm not real familiar with that. I know they have 510Ks on their software at the monitoring center, and they've validated performance of that. Beyond that, that's a separate entity, and I'm not real familiar with their regulatory path, other than I know they have 510Ks on their software. From a standpoint of reimbursement, there were new CPT codes that just went into place on January 1 of this year that reimburse for remote monitoring at service centers.
Are there further questions? If not, thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
a fascinating presentation.